Hello everyone, Vulcan here, and today I'm bringing you another RWBY discussion video, this one covering the topic of character tiers. In case you don't know what that means, this is simply a discussion on where a character or group of characters stand in terms of their overall combat abilities. I feel this is a very appropriate discussion to make, as RWBY is a very action-oriented story in addition to being a character-driven one. Monty's whole idea behind making RWBY was to create a show with slick animations involving girls with swords that are also guns in the first place, so if nothing else, this is a very fitting topic in my view. I feel this is a good time to make such a discussion now that we've seen more characters who should be top tiers fight extensively in Volume 4, and here I'm talking about Crow and Tyrion of course. Before I get started however, this video in particular isn't going to go in depth on any particular character. I plan on saving that kind of discussion for later videos where I would be pitting one particular character, or again a specific group of characters against another. Instead I want to focus on the overall placement of various characters which you've seen in battle enough times to make a reasonable estimation of where they stand in the grand scheme of things, and explain why I placed them where they are. In other words, minor characters that we've seen once, like members of Team Indigo and others that appeared in the Vital Festival, won't be getting the spotlight here in this video. Having said that, there will be characters that I'll be featuring based on the hype surrounding them, as we can infer where they would be based on things such as the lore and the way other characters behave around them. So without further ado, let's get this started. To begin with, I want to talk a little bit about Jean. Jean, as he appeared before Volume 4, or even before Volume 3, would have to go at the very bottom of the tier list for fairly obvious reasons. When he first appeared in Volume 1, Jean was never shown to have any exceptional ability or skill and ended up having to rely on everyone else for support. He did manage to land the position of leader of his team by virtue of guiding Team Juniper in their fight against the Deathstalker. That strategic mind came into play multiple times following this event, although some instances were questionable to say the least. If we were to apply RPG terms, his wisdom and charisma stats would be very high while everything else would be very low, if that makes any sense. So as far as his own fighting skills go, he left a lot to be desired. Having said that, at least by the start of Volume 3, he'd have moved up a tier to join other Academy students and other characters on that level, including most of the participants of the Vital Festival. Minor differences would exist between students that would lead one to think one particular student is stronger than the other. Here I'm thinking specifically about Yang and Arslan. In the first episode of Volume 3, it was pretty obvious that Arslan was edging out against Yang. Even if their exchange didn't make it clear, you could see on the board that Yang's aura was diminished to a greater extent compared to Arslan's before the end of the match. On a superficial level, that would imply Arslan is a better fighter than Yang, but later in the volume we get a similar thing happening when Yang and Weiss face off against Neon and Flint. Throughout that match, Neon was also pushing Yang around with apparent ease, much like Arslan was. However, once Yang's semblance took effect, she was able to solo both Neon and Flint. The point here is that although Yang was initially losing to Arslan, there was the possibility that something could have happened which would turn the tables, and we already know that by the end of the fight against Oberon, one punch from Yang was able to not only beat Arslan, but the rest of her team as well. We can tell from that by the end of the match, Yang had accumulated enough power through her semblance to be able to at least cause significant damage to Arslan if she could tag her even once. Seeing how she managed it against Neon, it's not outside the realm of possibility. This is why I place most Vital Festival participants on the same level. While there would be variations between different characters at this stage, they can mostly be ignored. It's only characters that we know are a cut above the rest based on what we're told by the story itself on top of what we're shown directly that I would place a tier above this. Pyrrha was certainly one such case. Both Ospen and Crow, in their own ways, inferred that Pyrrha was superior to the rest of her team, which was what eventually led to her being selected as the one to inherit Amber's maiden powers. Volume 2 also initially implied Team Coffee was itself a tier above the likes of Team RWBY. However, what we've seen in Volume 3 would suggest otherwise, and I think the reason why Coffee appeared to be superior to RWBY in Volume 2 was because they were better equipped to deal with the Grim infestation at the time. Although I didn't agree with Screw Attack's take on Yang in her death battle against Tifa, one point they made I think was a good one was that RWBY would have been exhausted from a whole night's work of fighting Grim on Mountain Glen. If not that, then at least the fact that Team RWBY had to fight a lot of White Fang soldiers on the train along with some of their more experienced fighters there. Yang in particular was beaten to a pulp by Neo and would have died if not for Raven saving her. Back to Team Coffee, the reason I'm not inclined to place them above Team RWBY is because of how easily Coco and Yatsu were beaten by Mercury and Emerald. I doubt anyone on Team RWBY would have been worse off by comparison. Sure, Yang beat Mercury in their match, but it's extremely likely that Mercury threw the fight to further Cinder's plan. Therefore, that match isn't one that is good to use for the sake of comparison in my opinion, similar to Mercury's fight with Pyrrha in the previous volume. So I think it's quite safe to assume that Pyrrha was the strongest student at Beacon Academy, if nothing else for the fact that the Illuminati chose her out of anyone else they could have selected, especially considering Pyrrha was still only a first year in a 4-year study course. The question of who can be placed directly above Pyrrha can be pretty tricky. For starters, I'd be tempted to place Mercury and Emerald on the same level as Pyrrha, but I can't be certain if Pyrrha would have handled both Coco and Yatsu as easily as Mercury did on his own. The reason I say that is because Mercury did kill his father, who was also known to be a world-class assassin, such that Cinder wished to recruit him. Yeah, you could say that it says little about Mercury because for all we know, the kid could have poisoned his dad to make killing him easier. The problem with that is we don't know if he did, so we can only assume that when it comes down to it, Mercury killed Marcus, thus proving his superiority. Not to mention that you could also speculate that Marcus, being an experienced assassin, would recognize if a drink was spiked, for example. But you could then argue that Marcus is always drunk due to Mercury's comment about Crow smelling like his dad did after a night of drinking. Well, Crow's always drunk too, but that didn't seem to hinder him against Tyrion, so it's hard to say what effect alcohol would have on anyone. Even in the real world, alcohol affects everyone differently, so it's a difficult thing to quantify. And with regards to Pyrrha, you could also argue that she could have in fact been able to beat both Coco and Yatsu on her own because her semblance would allow her to influence their weapons, but that's just it. Pyrrha would need her semblance, but we can't say if Mercury used his to fight them. If he didn't, chances are that he'd have had a much easier time against them than what we saw. Therefore, as far as Mercury goes, I'd place him a tier above Pyrrha, and as we can scale Emerald to Mercury, I'd place her on the same level. Before obtaining 80 maiden powers, I would also place Cinder on the same level simply because her performance against Amber wasn't anything outstanding compared to how Mercury and Emerald dealt with her. Mercury even managed to tank one of Amber's fire waves, though that was largely due to his prosthetics, and I consider that the most impressive feat from Cinder's team during that fight by far. Roman is another difficult character because he's not had any significant showings, and the showings that he's had seem to contradict each other at first sight. The first time we've seen him fighting, he was holding off two student-level fighters, Sun and Blake. One could therefore assume Roman is a tier above them, but not so much stronger that he'd stomp either of them individually. However, in Volume 2, Blake dominates her fight with Roman completely, so what gives? My argument regarding that instance is Blake caught him by surprise. Roman was familiar with the way Blake fought in Volume 1. At the time, mixing dust with her shadow clones wasn't part of her repertoire, so by the time they met again, he was caught completely by surprise, and that allowed Blake to gain the advantage quickly. This observation is supported by his third showing when he fought RWBY. Sure, Roman had Neo's support, but even after she was Mary Poppin, Roman still comfortably held the upper hand against RWBY, which further suggests that he is in fact above regular students as far as his ability goes. With that said, he'd have to at least be on the same level as Pyrrha, if not even be on par with Mercury and Emerald. Not that that's relevant anymore since he's dead, but I just wanted to talk about him because he must not be forgotten! From this point on, I feel that the placements are more clear-cut as there is more evidence surrounding higher tiers, especially after what we've seen in Volume 4 with Crow and Tyrion. We already know by word of God that Neo would mop the floor with Emerald and Mercury, which is why I'm confident in placing her a tier above them, and also feel that Adam should be at this level as well, for reasons we shall not outright mention here. I also think it's safe to put Taeyang and the other instructors at Beacon Academy, such as Port and Oobleck, at this level simply because the only characters I'd place above them are anyone who's part of the Illuminati. In other words, Crow, Ironwood, Glinda, and Ozpin himself. And to briefly mention Winter, I feel confident in placing her on par with Neo and Adam due to her fight with Crow. Although Crow was evidently taking it easy against her, her showing during that match was enough to convince me that she's definitely in that high mid-tier, if not low high tier level. Raven would also have to be on par with the Illuminati because it wouldn't make sense for her to be any weaker than Crow, especially when Neo ran for her life the moment she showed up to rescue Best Girl. Maiden Cinder would also have to be at this level given it's all but confirmed that she killed Ozpin, or at least that iteration of Ozpin after a tough match. The reason I put Taeyang below Raven and Crow is because while he may have been on the same team as them, he tells Yang that he was still too sore to have another sparring match with her after the previous one, not to mention the fact that he has been implied to be the weakest link in Team Stark. I feel that if Tai was any stronger, he wouldn't have said that. That is, unless Yang's training with him made her so skilled that she skipped a few tiers. By extension, Team Witch would have to be on the same level as the Illuminati given the way Tyrion managed to fight against Crow. Ozpin also seemed very cautious around Hazel when he appeared before Oscar, which should say something about its standing. Finally, above everyone else would have to be Salem. While we haven't seen her fighting anyone, the fact that Team Witch is completely subservient to her, and given the implication that she could be the current iteration of the God of Darkness, it's likely she is the God tier of RWBY at present. In future videos, I hope to be able to go into more detail on specific characters through matchups. One matchup that I'm interested in particular is Emerald and Mercury versus Neo. Although I did say that Word of God confirmed Neo to be superior to them, a discussion on how a match would actually go would be very interesting once you pair up Mercury's CQC with Emerald's illusions. And of course, if there are any matchups that you're interested in, let me know in the comment section so that I can have a think about them. As usual, let me know what you think in the comment section below about this tier list, especially if you feel some characters should be in a tier above or below where I place them. If you enjoyed this video, do leave a like, subscribe to my channel to see more, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.